The changing world order. Just want to take about 20 minutes of your time to delve to the last 500 years of history and check out similar patterns which has existed for dominating superpowers, which changes from time to time. From the last 500 years, it all started up with the Dutch Empire, to the British, currently for the United States, and for the future, which probably goes to China. This video forms the continuation of the video How the World Order Changes and has its link in the description below. We entreat you to watch that one as well to get a complete picture of what we want to pass along to you. Each country here would be represented by a typical cycle, and it's got three phases: the rise, the top, and the decline, just as a simple template. The rise. The rise of successful new empires are always initiated by a very powerful revolutionary leaders who do four things. They obtain power by gaining more support than their opposition. They consolidate power by weakening or removing the opposition so that they don't stand in their way. They develop systems and institutions that ensure the country's smooth operation. They carefully select their successors or create systems that do so. After any war is won by a party, there is usually a period of peace and expanding wealth because the leadership is clearly dominating and has widespread support. So no one wants to fight it. Leaders of that country build an effective system to increase the country's riches and power in order to be great throughout the phase. They've got strong education that teaches not only information and skills, but also character, civility, and work ethics. These are often taught in schools, families, and religious organizations that provides a healthy respect for rules and order within society and lower corruption as well. With this, it enables them to unite up to become great as possible. So as they do this, their focus shifts from producing basic goods to innovating and inventing new technologies. For example, the Dutch defeated the Habsburg Empire and they were superly educated as well. They became so inventive that they came up with a quarter of all major inventions in the world. The most notable of them was the invention of ships. These journeys around the world search for the bigger worlds and inventions. They, like all great empires, they develop their thinking by being open to the greatest thinking in the world. As a result, the country's people become more productive and competitive in the global market, which shows in their economic output as well. You can see this happening now as the US and China are roughly comparable in both their economic output and their share of the world's trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from foreign attacks. So they develop great military strength. They also develop systems to incentivize and empower those who have the ability to make or take the greater wealth from people. In all these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs, including China as well. They developed their capital market, most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investment to fund inventions and development. So as a natural consequence of this, the world's greatest empire develops the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. The first publicly listed company throughout history came from the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock market to fund it as well. Both of these were integral parts of the system that takes from others to produce further massive wealth and power to another party. Greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's wealth. Amsterdam was there then for the Dutch, the London came for the British, New York is now for the United States, and China is developing its financial centers like the Shanghai, Beijing, or Hong Kong. In all these empires that existed before, the capitalists, the government, and the military worked together. For instance, the Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out to the global markets to make and take greater wars from people. The British followed with the British East India Company and had similar coordination of the government, business, and military operations. The military-industrial complex came from the United States,
whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex,
as well as the Chinese system is rapidly following. If a country becomes the largest international trading center, most international transactions are paid in its currency, and also people all around the world save in that currency, making it the preferred storehold of wealth and thus the world's leading reserve currency. When the Dutch led the world trade, the guilder was the world's principal reserve currency. The pound was when the British led, and the United States has been since it's the United States leading. Chinese currency is of course becoming more widely utilized as a reserve currency. If one got his currency as a reserve one, that empire can borrow more than other countries do. This gives the empire a greater advantage because people all around the world are willing to save and thereby lend back their currency to you. Countries without reserve currency don't have such an opportunity. When empires run out of its own money, like the US in the 1971, they don't have anything to fall back on. There's always an option to print more and more. This imperial reserve currency privilege leads them to borrow as much, which eventually starts a financial bubble. All the empires around the world that became the most powerful followed these footsteps up to the top. The top. While most of these strengths are sustained for a longer period and has reached its peak at the top phase, what's next? Anyway, a real state. Your seed of your collapse will surely be embedded in the fruit of your success. People in these wealthy and powerful countries earn more and more. They become more expensive and less competitive in comparison to people in other countries ready to work for less. Simultaneously, people in other countries naturally copy the leading powers' method and technologies, and thus reducing the leading powers' competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders has less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders do. So the Dutch were hired to design better ships, and the British were made to build since they've got less expensive workers. This made them so competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as individuals become wealthier, they tend to work less and spend more time on the finer and less productive aspects of life. In fact, they become very decadent. Value shifts from generation to generation during the rise to the top phase, from those who struggled for the riches and power to those who inherited it. The inheritors are less battle-hardened, they are luxuriant and accustomed to the finer, comfortable life, making them more vulnerable to difficulties. Throughout the Dutch Golden Age to the British Victorian era, when people get used to doing well during such periods of great prosperity, they begin to bet on it continuing. And how do they do that? They borrow money. This eventually leads to a financial bubble. And all these empires follow these footsteps to the top. What gaps are self-reinforcing since the rich use their superior resources to enhance their authority. For instance, they provide their children with more advantage, such as better education. They use the political system to clout to their own advantage. This widens the gap between the rich, the haves, and the poor, the have-nots. In terms of values, politics, and opportunities. Those who are less well off believe the system is unfair, so resentment grows. However, as long as standard living continues to rise, these gaps and resentment do not boil into conflict at all. Having the world's leading reserve currency negatively leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debt with foreign lenders. While boosting short-term spending power, it has a long-term negative impact on the country's financial health and currency as well. To put it in another way, when borrowing and expenditure are high, the empire appears to be very powerful, but its finances is at a great harm. Borrowing extends a country's power beyond its fundamental by funding domestic consumption, as well as international military conflicts which is required to maintain every empire. Eventually, the cost of maintaining and protecting an empire exceeds the revenue it generates to the country. This makes empire ownership unprofitable business. For example, the Dutch Empire became overextended over the world, and to maintain its territories and trade routes, it fought increasingly expensive wars with the British and other European countries. Similar to the competitor countries such as Germany, the British Empire grew up massively bureaucratic and lost its competitive advantage, leading to the increasingly expensive arms race and World War. Eventually, the cost of maintaining and protecting an empire exceeds the revenue it generates to the country. This makes empire ownership unprofitable. For example, the Dutch Empire became overextended over the world, and to maintain its territories and trade routes, it fought increasingly expensive wars with the British and other European countries. Similarly to competitor countries such as Germany, the British Empire grew massively bureaucratic and lost its competitive advantage, leading to an increasingly expensive arms race and World War. The United States has spent approximately $8 trillion on foreign wars and their aftermath since September 11th. It has spent trillions of dollars on various military activities and sustaining military sites in as many as 70 countries. Richer countries eventually become more in debt as a result of borrowing from poorer countries that save more. This even began in the 1980s when the United States, which has a per capita income 40 times as that of China, began to borrow from even the Chinese who want to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's leading reserve currency. This is one of the first signals of a shift in wealth and power from a superpower. We've treated the rise, the top, now we're on the third phase, which is the decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal and costly external fighting. This decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. If empires run out of new lenders, people holding that currency will sell off and get out quickly, rather than they used to do, which is buy, save, lend, and even get in again. With this, the empire's strength begins to wane. Internal economic weakness combined with costly internal and external fighting, or both, causes the empire to deteriorate gradually before suddenly collapsing. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn, and the empire can no longer borrow money necessary to repay its debt, then the financial bubble finally gets into a burst. This creates great domestic hardship and puts the empire into a dilemma, either to default on its debts or print another large amount of fresh money again. They always, however, opt to print large amounts of fresh money and initially, gradually, rapidly depreciating the currency and raise inflation. The Dutch experienced financial crisis as a result of the financial excesses and costs of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, the British currently now are still repaying their financial excesses and debts incurred during the various two world wars that happened. While the United States has had 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 1990s, with the central bank fortunately stepping in with tougher measures each and every time. Whenever the government has problem funding itself, when there are bad economic conditions and living standards of people begin to decline, There are large world values and political gaps, and internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different various ethnic, religious, racial groups greatly continue to rise. This leads to political extremism, which manifests itself as a left and a right wing for populism. Those on the left who want to redistribute wealth as a system, while those on the right wants to keep the hands of the wealth by a specific small group. During such time, taxes on the rich rises, which poses fear that their wealth and well-being will be taken away. They eventually move to other assets and currencies where they feel safer. These outflows reduce the empire's tax revenue, leading the classic self-reinforcing hollowing out process. When the flight of wealth becomes very severe enough, then government has no option than just to outlaw it. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, reducing the national economic pie and increasing disputes over how to divide the national cake. As a result, conflict within the country escalates, populous leading leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. This is when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. And when people move to strong populous leaders who will bring order to the chaos, this leads to revolution or a civil war. This happens just to redistribute riches and impose major changes in the empire. It can happen peacefully and maintain the status quo anyway, or it can be more violent and disruptive. For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained an established internal order. The French Revolution was very peaceful, but the Russian and Chinese Revolution were far more violent and resulting into new internal regimes. This internal conflict makes the empire very weak and vulnerable to rise external rivals who see this domestic weakness as an opportunity to challenge the existing power. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparably great military. Since there are no sustainable framework for resolving international disputes peacefully in the reality, conflicts are usually handled through power struggles. As the leading power faces tougher obstacles, it must choose between fighting or to retreat. Fighting and losing is the worst consequence a country can choose, but withdrawing is also undesirable since it gives the opponents an advantage and it sends message that the empire is very weak to those countries debating on which side to support. Poor economic conditions leads to increased battling for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to a war. Through this, individuals owning the reserve currency and seeing debts of a failing empire, they lose trust and eventually all of them sell off. Here, the world's grand cycle suddenly comes to an end. And of roughly 750 currencies that have existed for about 1,700 years ago, less than 20% are still now surviving. For the Dutch, all of them have been depreciated as a result of the defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they were unable to repay their debt incurred during the conflict. With years, it resulted in a severe bank run. This was what frenzied the sell-off of the Amsterdam Bank. After World War II, when the British were unable to repay their massive debt they had borrowed to fund their wars, they were forced to engage in massive money printing, which devalued their currency and rendered the empire very weak. This results in a series of devaluation and sell-off of the British pound. As the US dollar emerges as the dominant currency, this ushers the new world order. Currently now, the United States has significant debt. It spends more than it earns and pays these deficits with further borrowing and printing massive quantities of new money. Stories of this rise and fall of empires are fundamentally the same, just that they only come in different clothes they wore. These indicators listed above here is what determine the stage an empire is in at the moment, how fit it is, and whether its conditions are improving or worsening. To learn more about the world order today, get your hands on Ray Dalio's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, since this video forms an extract summarized from that book. Remember to watch the part 1 as well.